Okay, hello everybody, and welcome. It's lovely to see your beautiful, beautiful faces at our panel. I know this is actually the first panel held by London Platypus chapter since the pandemic, so we're all very excited for this to be happening. And a lot of gratitude again to everybody who helped organize this and who is participating. So this is, as I said, the London chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I was just telling Rory, I think we were first established in 2012, so this makes it the 10th year of Platypus being in the UK, which feels nice. But what is Platypus? So we're just going to do the usual spiel to summarize what we do, what motivates us. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So the title of this panel is entitled "The Enough is Enough Campaign and the Left." So, across Europe, skyrocketing energy prices and inflation have created a cost of living crisis amid the aftermath of COVID lockdowns and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Protests and campaigns have sprung up in response. The Platypus Affiliated Society invites you to discuss the meaning of the current crisis and responses to it for the left. So some questions that we posed to the panelists. How do you understand the present crisis, its origins and conditions? How, therefore, has the left responded, and how should the left respond to this situation? What are the tasks facing the left in the present crisis, and what obstacles does the left face? And are there any historical precedents for the left to learn from? So before we begin, I'm just going to go a bit over the format. So we will be starting with opening responses from each of the panelists. We will then allow the panelists to respond to each other before opening up to an audience Q&A. So before we open up to our opening responses, I will ask each of the panelists in turn to introduce themselves. Starting from Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, my name's Kevin Bean. I'm based in Liverpool, so I'm visiting London for a few days and not normally here in the big city. I'm a member of Labour Party Marxist, supporter of the weekly worker, so I think that would best locate my politics. I'm also an expelled secretary of Wavertree constituency Labour Party, but then there's quite a lot of people in that boat, so it's probably not a great mark of distinction.
My name's Daniel Randall. I'm a London Underground worker and an RMT rep. I'm a supporter of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty and still a Labour Party member for now, although my organisation has been proscribed, so it might not last for very long.
Hello, I'm Richard Brenner. I've been a Marxist activist in Britain since 1983. I have found myself involved on the steering group of something called the Socialist Labour Network, which is an alliance of a group of Labour Party members that were expelled from the Labour Party and a group of Labour Party members that were exiled, as they put it, from the Labour Party, which means some of them left before they were thrown out. The organisation is 700 strong. Its age profile is, well, let's just say that you people would dramatically lower its age profile. And it is committed to campaigning for a new working class party, for the unity of the forces in each town and city that are fighting back against inflation and around the cost of living, practical and organisational unity. And we try to do the things that we stand for, rather than just recruit ones and twos on the basis that they agree with what we stand for. But it's very much a work in progress and an imperfect formation. And I'm interested in hearing what you guys have got to say tonight.
Excellent, thank you guys very much. So I think we're going to begin with you, Kevin, if that's all right. So we are going to time you guys for, say, 10, 15? Let's go 10. We'll go 10.
Okay.
So I'll give you a 5-minute warning, and then 1 or say 2-minute warning. 5 and a 2. Okay, let me just get this set up real quick. And then we shall begin. This is where I look like an absolute donkey. Okay, let's go.
Okay. I've thought long and hard about the issue of crisis, partly because it's a very overused word, and when I became involved in, I suppose, organised left politics in the early 70s, it was a frequently discussed topic about the nature of the crisis in Britain, or indeed the crisis in capitalism. And I want to just frame it, I suppose, in both a long and a short-term way. First of all, in terms of the long term, I think Marxists have argued from the closing decades of the 19th century, certainly by the time of the First World War, that capitalism was in a fundamental crisis. It had reached its limits. Imperialism, the imperialist wars had shown that. And so the sense that we were living in a period of extended crisis, I think, has been pretty predominant throughout the 20th century. In particular, I think the idea that we're in what Hillel Tichting regards as a transitional period, and that idea that we're in the period in which capitalism has, in a sense, played itself out, but in the summary of the Gramsci quote, the new is waiting to be born, that we are, in a sense, on the cusp of something. So that's, I think, a premise I'm going to start from in the general sense. And I know certainly, because I've read quite a lot of platypus material, I think I've even attended a few meetings which you've organised around the edge of weekly worker events. So I know that you're certainly interested in that idea of the sort of periodisation of crisis. So I'm looking at it in both the long-term sense. I see, for example, the Russian Revolution and the attempts at revolutionary movements as attempts to overcome the crisis of capitalism, but also that the failures of those revolutions and the type of regimes that they threw up also represent something of a dead end, and a failure to surmount that crisis. So if we take that in a sense globally, there's also, of course, the phenomenon of areas of the world in which capitalism is still developing, and so we might see, for example, the crisis taking different forms in different countries. It's very clear, for example, that if you think of geopolitics and you think of the rivalry between China and the United States, between a relatively declining hegemonic power and a rising power, that too will throw up other particular forms of crisis. So I think I want to look at it in that broad view. In terms of a specific British or European crisis, then I think the immediate economic crisis that we see, and the sort of things that have been described about cost of living, energy, attacks on living standards, the attempt to certainly shift the burden of paying for a capitalist crisis onto away from property owners onto those who don't have access to property, particularly I think even within sections of the working class and the middle class, attempts to shift much of the payment onto the poorest paid and the least powerful in that way. The other patterns of crisis I see are also quite obviously political. And again, the type of arguments that many people have made on the left about the question of leadership, of party, of the alternative, and I know there will be different views in this room, But I think responding to those ideas is a fairly central issue for the left. It's also, I think, a problem. I'm thinking particularly of the collapse both of many traditional forms of organisation and many traditional forms of politics. And that sense of crisis, or those forms of crisis, I think certainly occur not only in the working class movement, but I think also in what we might think of as bourgeois politics. So the phenomenon, for example, that we saw in Italy in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, the collapse of the established party system, in many ways we're seeing something similar in many other European countries, particularly in this one. So I think we have a generalised sense of change, a generalised sense of crisis across all forms of organisation. I think the recent developments in the Conservative Party, again, I think are quite significant in that way. But also bringing things closer back to my own party involvement in the Labour Party, which I'd joined in 1970 and remained with various degrees of activity, a continuous member until just recently when I was expelled. The crisis there is not just, I think, of Starmer's own particular electoral problems. There's a deeper problem for the left, and I think the failure of the left, particularly the failure of the mass left-wing movement that was energised around Corbyn, also points to some problems of I suppose of strategy and tactics, of party and programme, which are ideas that I'd like to take up further. So we have, I think, in my sort of wide view, I've been trying to look at it as both a long-term pattern of crisis. I certainly see capitalism as a system unable to not only develop productive resources, but producing wars, producing ecological disaster, and I don't see it having any degree of permanence. And indeed, that sort of acceleration of those elements has certainly increased in my lifetime. I think it's certainly speeded up after that post 1989 period. But I think what we're debating is both the nature of that crisis. For example, have I overstated the crisis? Does capitalism have the ability to maybe stabilise itself? And then, of course, if it doesn't, what is the response of the left? And perhaps worryingly, what is the response of the right? I'm not, sort of jumping on the, fascism round the corner, but it's very clear that states and mainstream conservative parties will, I think, turn to the right, and the failure of the left and the working class movement, I think, will then prove disastrous if we don't come up with an alternative, if we don't develop our own politics. So I hope that I've sort of framed it in the broader sense. I can come back on particular aspects, but I wanted to look at it both in the long-term sense, but also in the more immediate sense. No.
Grand, thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, Daniel.
All right, thanks. Well, thanks to Platypus for the invitation to speak here. As I mentioned in introducing myself, I'm a London Underground worker, and as I hope you have noticed, we were on strike today. I was on a picket line from 5 o'clock, so I'm a bit exhausted. I hope you'll make allowances for kind of strike-induced fatigue if this is not a particularly sort of sparklingly performative speech. So, in terms of crisis, I think it's clear now that we are on the precipice of a new, something that it's reasonable to call a new crisis, and that's not a crisis in the, I think, rather loose sort of generic sense in which leftists have a sort of knee-jerk habit of proclaiming almost any moment at any time to be a moment of crisis. And I think there's a sort of there's a kind of timelessness about the phrase "the crisis of capitalism," which I think can rob it of some explanatory value. But I think now we are on the precipice of a real crisis, a real period of kind of economic trauma, in which businesses collapse and people lose their jobs and their homes. The Bank of England says that we face potentially the longest ever recession that the country has faced, and the government's response is almost, well, we know it's going to be very, very deep cuts, which, as I say, I think are going to lead to a lot of kind of social trauma in the lives of working class people. So that's the context. In the interest of sort of managing audience expectations a little bit, I'm not really going to be picking apart the sort of mechanics of that too much. I'm going to be focusing pretty exclusively on one dynamic within the current moment, which is the strike wave that's taking place in this country, and that's not out of a sort of solipsistic desire to just talk about my own experiences, but for reasons that I'll go on to explain. The strike wave that we're now seeing around us, and hopefully not just seeing and experiencing but participating in, is of generational significance. That's not an over-exaggeration, at least in terms of its scale. This year is on track to see the highest number of strike days since 1989. That's nearly my entire lifetime, perhaps longer than the lifetime of some of the people in the room. Obviously, the trade union movement that's kind of organising these strikes is quite inadequate from a revolutionary perspective. And I think it would be quite easy to be a bit sniffy and dismissive about it, especially given that in some ways, at least in terms of two of the highest profile national disputes on the National Rail and in the Post, it looks like things might have begun to falter a little bit. But I think if we want our Marxism, and I'm sort of taking a certain shared point of departure here for granted, if we want our Marxism to be a living instrument to intervene in real life, rather than a sort of abstract doctrine developed by a priest caste, then I think we have to, as Trotsky put it, base ourselves on the logic of the class struggle. And that struggle doesn't happen exclusively in workplaces by any means, but I think it is embodied there in a specific and I would argue essential way. And mass action by workers, organised as workers at the point of production, is what you might call the sine qua non of any meaningful anti-capitalist politics. So that's why I want to focus on the strike wave. One of the prompts that we were asked to consider as panellists was what are the tasks facing the left? And I think if forced to summarise that very succinctly, I would say that the overarching task of the left, although really I'm referring to the revolutionary left, is to undertake a transformational effort within the existing labour movement, understood broadly, that seeks to revolutionise that movement in order that that movement is capable of making a revolution in society. One question that I think is posed quite sharply in the current strike wave, and which appears superficially as a sort of organisational matter, but I think has much wider political and ideological implications, is what might be termed the question of democratic control. Who's actually in the driving seat of these disputes? In the 2011 public sector pension strikes, which was the last truly kind of mass strike in this country, also occurred in the aftermath and in the context of an economic crisis. The mass membership was essentially passive, and I hesitate to use that word to describe, over 1 million workers going on strike, but I'm trying to pose things starkly. The rank and file, the mass membership there was effectively sort of deployed as a stage army in a strategy wholly determined and controlled by union officialdoms. And I think to avoid a repeat of that in this strike wave, we need democratic mechanisms that place the decisions about strike strategy, when to strike, for how long, for what demands, etc., as close to the shop floor as possible. And where those mechanisms already exist in some form, as they do in some unions, which have more democratic constitutional setups than others, I think the struggle is to kind of activate them and encourage workers to use them. Now, we shouldn't assume that greater rank and file control automatically means greater militancy. But socialists are, or should be, in my view, for the maximum degree of democracy in any given moment as a good thing in and of itself. Our whole project, as I see it, starts from the development of class consciousness and confidence, convincing workers of the idea that we can determine our own destinies. And if the power relation within our own organisations is one in which we understand our role simply as being to follow orders from above, then that's not only a potential break on struggle, but also a structural impediment to building up that kind of class confidence. If workers don't see our own unions as something we directly and democratically control, then I think the idea that we could directly and democratically control the running of society is always going to seem like an impossible horizon. And I think socialists will contribute most to the realisation of new opportunities to develop that kind of rank and file independence of mind and of action, potentially, by throwing ourselves into this strike wave, fighting to carry it forward, to spread it in our own workplaces and industries, and to build local networks around trades councils, which I think there's a real opportunity to revive now, and local labour parties where possible for practical solidarity and as forums for discussion of the political questions that are posed by the disputes. The title and publicity for tonight's meeting referred quite kind of foregrounded the Enough is Enough campaign in a way that, if you'll allow some gentle criticism, I think didn't particularly connect with the prompts that we were asked to consider. But just to say a word on that here, I think local Enough is Enough groups could feature in this as local hubs for developing strike solidarity if they can be given real democratic life, and if the campaign can move beyond its current form, which is essentially a sort of vehicle for organising rallies at which various trade union leaders can make rousing speeches. I don't really have a great deal to say about Enough is Enough specifically beyond that, but if that's something people particularly want to discuss, then I'm sure we can. The last thing I want to talk about is how an upsurge in industrial militancy connects to politics, to political action, and to the struggle for and the kind of horizon of social transformation. For revolutionary socialists, workers' action isn't just a means to improve our material conditions under capitalism, although it is that, absolutely. It's a key part, as I've suggested, the key part of the means by which we can reshape society as a whole. The legislative regime, the legal regime that confronts workers in this country, I will speak faster. Is the kind of aggregated product of generation of defeats for our class, and I think is specifically designed to confine workers' action to narrow economic channels. Legal prohibitions on strikes over political issues, prohibitions on strikes in solidarity with other workers. These constraints aim to prevent industrial action sort of bursting its banks and flooding over into the political sphere. Often union officials, and not only officials, will internalise those constraints, and you'll sometimes hear them bemoaning the kind of politicisation of disputes. But some of those same officials are entirely correctly politicising our disputes themselves. So, for example, my General Secretary, who's become a bit of a celebrity in this moment, Mick Lynch, has continually emphasised social inequality as a key context for our strikes. He said, in effect, RMT's fighting for all workers to have a pay rise. And that's a political question. A society-wide increase in wages and benefits based on a substantial increase in the minimum wage and inflation-proof pay rises for all, that requires government action. And the more striking unions raise this, the more current strikes will test the limits of that legal prohibition on unions striking for political demands, especially if there is substantial cross-union coordination. So I'm not going to be able to finish my speech in the time I've got, so I don't know whether are you happy for me to go on, or I'll curtail it now and come back to it later. Which would you?
Yeah, you can bring it back up. Okay,
all right, well, I'll stop there, and more to come.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
So I'm also not going to be able to get everything into 10 minutes. I can talk about the crisis, or I can talk about the fight back and the situation on the ground across Britain, or I can try and do both unsuccessfully, which is what I'm going to try and do. So Britain in decline is the underlying phenomenon that we see. British capitalism in decline. There are two theses in British Marxist discourse as to why that is. We can discount one of them, the Nairn-Anderson thesis, the idea that Britain is essentially not capitalist enough, that the institutions of finance capital have essentially obstructed Britain's capitalist development, that the monarchy, that the Bank of England, that the Treasury, that the City of London essentially exist as some sort of institutional legacy of pre-capitalism and of the insufficiency of the British bourgeoisie in having not forced through its revolutionary aims in the way that the French did in the 18th century, when the British actually attempted to do so in the 17th century. And I think we can discount that thesis. I think we can see that the institutions of British finance, capital, and the credit intensity of GDP in Britain are products of declining profitability in manufacturing, and that if we want to get all volume 3 about things, which I'm perfectly happy to, then what we're actually seeing is an overaccumulation of capital, more capital generated than can be sufficient, that can be invested for a sufficient profit. That is driven, yes, by the underlying laws of development, which mean that an increase in the technical composition of capital in Britain means that that profitability declines, but also we've seen attempts to offset that by coupon clipping, as Lenin called it in imperialism, by the overgrowth of the parasitic section of British capital, fictitious capital. We're sitting in the region that judiciates the disputes that arise from the ever more complex forms that money takes in a country or a jurisdiction where fictitious capital plays an increasingly important role. And that has caused not only Britain's sensitivity to credit-driven crises and but also its political instability, because there is no stable single party of the British ruling class unmediated by the contradictions of the particular class alliances it has to put together. The Tory party obviously is an attempt on the part of finance capital to establish for itself a dependable political vehicle, but they are too small, they are too narrow, they lack a social base sufficient to be able to construct a national political party. And it was very clear after 2007, 2008 that the solution that the British Conservative Party has had to put in place, which is to attach to finance capital and its representatives a sort of backwater of backwoods, shire, enraged right-wing petty bourgeois, became a bit too enraged after 2007, 2008, and was susceptible to populist agitation, which meant that their interests and the interests of the banks and large professional services companies that surround us as we speak right now went slightly out of kilter. Of course, there are always those in the hedge funds and other uber-parasitic sections of British capital that can capitalise on any form of instability, but nevertheless it was very clear by 2016 and the Brexit referendum that British capital and its party were in a very serious structural crisis. Now, I think that the crisis that we have seen, what we saw in 2007, 2008, was obviously something which closely maps to, I mean, I'm not a great fan of David Harvey, but in his book Limits of Capital, he does quite an interesting heuristic device where he talks about there being 3 cuts that you can take when you're approaching a Marxist crisis. You can look at the overaccumulation of capital, and we saw that very clearly in a crisis of profitability that was emerging in the mid 2000s. You then see obviously a crisis in the credit system, which we saw, and in particular around property, and we can talk about the role of property in Britain in a moment, but it's very important. It was the secret to the Tories' strategy for stabilising the British polity that there should be permanent house price growth in order to keep quiet, first of all, their own supporters, and also an important layer of 27% of the population that own property and who therefore had an appreciating asset. And then we also see the attempts at geopolitical relations used to switch the burden of the crisis. We've got the crisis is a seismic process of devaluation of capital, and if capital can grow in a fictitious way, it cannot be devalued in a fictitious way. It can only be devalued in real space, real time, real places, and hitting real people. So there's a struggle between businesses over who will bear the burden of devaluation. There's a struggle between states over who will bear the burden of devaluation. And there's a struggle between classes, and we're seeing all of those things taking place right now in front of us at the moment. And yes, inflation is a form of the devaluation of capital. It's a form of the devaluation of the workers' wages and what they get in return for that.
5 minutes.
good, because we go now to the political side of things. So that worked out very nicely, because, of course, you're interested in periodisation, I hear. I'm not, particularly. I spent far too long worrying about long, reified concepts of periods within capitalism. I'm interested in the epoch of imperialism, and I'm interested in situations. And I'm also interested in the trade-industrial cycle, which, for whatever reason, does seem to map fairly closely to a chronology of 7 to 10 years. So we had one in 2015 where there was a significant downturn, and we were scheduled to have one in 2022 anyway, if you count it in sevens. Of course, it's not always in sevens, but you know what I mean. Now, of course, COVID as a sort of a sort of exogenous shock, a contingent event, saw an inflationary and the disequilibrium of inflationary reactivation of economic activity after its artificial downturn, which has meant that we're going into this particular crisis with consumer good inflation and with property price inflation and with the inflation of a range of other assets. How did this dysfunctional Tory party deal with it? Well, Johnson got himself tangled up through his own inadequacies, but Truss was brought in at that point, and her attempted fiscal actions clearly exacerbated the situation in one way only, which was that the bond markets, we talked about the dependency of British capitalism on credit, the bond markets hated it, hated the fact that there were tax cuts that couldn't be paid for, that this threatened to burn down the pension system and burn down the ability of people to repay their mortgages. Fixed rate mortgages that come up for renewal within the next 2 or 3 years, and variable mortgages which immediately go up massively. And therefore this threatened to destroy the Tories' own base, as well as to undermine the key underpinnings for social stability in Britain today. So they got rid of her, and now Sunak and Hunt propose to do the opposite, but actually they're going to undertake pro-cyclical action. Cuts in public spending, but they're also going to allow significant interest rate rises from the bank, which they hope will propel real interest rate rises, because what they're concerned about is inflation, not the inflation that your rent is going to go through, or that 500 grams of mild cheddar goes through, which is 40%, by the way, not 14% or 10%, because the comrades in Leicester Enough is Enough, not run by National Enough is Enough, 1,300 people who set it up on their own and are organising it in Leicester with people from the initial Labour movement, have actually running their own cost of living index, because one of them had read Trotsky's transitional programme and thought that would be a good idea. There's something about price committees, but instead of being for it and going to a university and recruiting 2 people to this idea, they decided to do what they were supposed to do with it and actually involve people in bringing it into being. That happened. Now, clearly, the real aim of the pro-cyclical action is to devalue workers' wages further, and to make workers pay the cost of the devaluation, and to make us pay. And clearly, that's what Daniel's on strike about. And what I just wanted to say very briefly at the end of all of this is that the pervasive sense of social crisis that began at the beginning of the year, and particularly in February when the price rises started coming through, when people started to realise what was going on, and it was magnified by the crisis of the Tory government and Tory regime, and which, when we saw the huge demonstration in June, which was so big that even the Morning Star called for councils of action all over Britain, the General Secretary must have fallen out of bed that day and landed on the Trotsky side of the bed and decided he wanted councils of action all over Britain. I agree. Socialist Labour Network wrote to him, wrote to the CWU, wrote to the RMT, wrote to everybody and said, why don't we form joint committees all over the country? And the next day, nothing to do with our letter, by the way, Enough is Enough was formed, but without the Communist Party, without momentum, without a whole number of people. And my understanding from my friends on the executive of the RMT is that the RMT were not consulted initially about the launch. What we need are 2 things, and this is the very last thing I will say. Right? One of them is to remember that we're supposed to be about uniting the working class. The united front is a tactic, yes, but uniting the working class is a strategy, and at every town, every city, whether it's called Don't Pay, whether it's called Enough is Enough, whether it's called People's Assembly, without waiting for the leaders, bring the people together ourselves in coordinating struggle to support the strikes, to get in the faces of the energy companies, to get in the faces of the banks, and to organise action. And the second thing that we are supposed to be doing, and which none of the British far left groups seem to have remembered or have understood, is not to build sects. We are not supposed to be building sects. Marx said, don't build a sect. Lenin didn't build a sect. None of the Marxists that actually managed to build mass working class parties built sects. We're supposed to be bringing together really existing forces in a credible process for the formation of the co-creation of a real political party.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Richard. Okay, and take breath. And then we will continue with responses from panelists to each other. I'm going to say you can use this time, so I'm going to give you guys 7 minutes each. But you're welcome to use this time to round off any other things you wanted to say. And if not, you can use the cue. Maybe one of our lovely audience members will ask you the right question for you to get that out as well. So we're going to start again with Kevin.
Okay. I did a sketch, and I think the sketch, there's certain overlaps with both Daniel and with Richard. I think probably more with Richard than with Daniel. I think the difference I have with Daniel is that he obviously sees working class militancy, sees trade union activity as very important, but I think what he doesn't do is to talk about the importance of politics in that. In particular, he talks about the way that strikes and so forth can develop confidence, develop class consciousness. And of course, we're going back to debates that were held in the movement at the late 19th, early 20th century. There's been a persistent theme. So my comment on that is that the way that political consciousness develops out of the strike movement, does it arise simply from the struggle for democracy in the unions? Does it arise from the resistance of employers through the law, or does it arise through a particular political project? And I would argue that we do need quite a conscious political project, and that without that, then our struggles, I think, remain quite confined really around the conditions of wage labour. I particularly like to sort of draw on the experience. I don't want to sort of do the, in when I was a lad, but I do think that the comparison, say, with the 70s movement are quite interesting, and I think we do need to. I was getting to that. Yeah, we need to look at that, and in particular the clear differences. I don't say this with any enthusiasm. In fact, I say it with a degree of depression. Is that I think that the left, and I include that, by people who claim to be Marxist or revolutionary, which may include some people on the left of the Labour Party or not, probably now much weaker than at any time in my my political life, which, as I say, extends in various forms back to the early 70s. So I think the task of building the left, and in particular, the type of party and the programme, the sort of points that Richard is making around that, are really, I think, quite central, and that the industrial militancy that we've seen is a starting point. It does certainly draw people towards those developments. My own union will be going on strike shortly, and I've seen the way that strikes do change and do have an impact on confidence. But I think that without a specifically political programme, and particularly from my point of view, the idea of building a principled party of the left around Marxism, then I think all that we will be left with will be militant trade unionism. And, you know, the experiences, whether they be of the Communist Party in the 60s and 70s, the International Socialist and Socialist Workers' Party in that same period, all point, I think, to the limitations of strike struggles. So I think to come up with a sort of argument, which is what you're seeming to suggest, that these struggles will throw up a particular type of political consciousness automatically, and in particular they will be arising from the confrontation with the law. I think I think we can see the limitations of that. I think that's going to be one of the central points of difference, or if not difference, the central points of discussion that we'll be having this evening. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Daniel?
So I sort of stopped my speech at a particular point, which might have given a slightly unrepresentative impression. So I'm going to use my time to just finish what I had to say, and I think most of it will probably address the comments that Kevin has just made. So you may remember, if you cast your minds way back to, whenever it was, 17 minutes ago, I was talking about precisely this question, how industrial militancy connects to the question of politics and to the sort of horizon of social transformation. And I was talking about, potential sort of testing of the limits of the law, but I don't in fact think that there's a sort of automatic progression from industrial militancy to a testing of the law to a kind of confrontation with the state to workers' power. That's not my view. So how do these things connect? So Mick Lynch, my General Secretary, has recently said that he believes that socialism, which he defined in this particular interview as the elimination of poverty, we can debate if there's a bit more to it than that, won't be achieved by what he called an ideology-based party, but rather through, quote, the pragmatic reform of our system. Now, I'm sure I don't need to point out to anyone in this audience that the belief that socialism, however you're defining that, to be honest, the belief that that can be achieved through pragmatic reforms, that is in and of itself very much an ideological claim. And I think these comments give at least some sense of the thinking of at least a section of the sort of union leadership, which essentially is that we can achieve some degree of social transformation via an aggregation of industrial struggles over fairly narrow economic issues. The prompts for the panelist asked us to consider historical precedents for this moment, and like Kevin, one I particularly wanted to draw out is the period of upsurge in industrial struggle in the 1970s, which saw a strike wave kind of topple a Tory government. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but not too much. And I think part of what held back and limited and ultimately led to the kind of defeat or failure to realise the potential of that upsurge was the failure to develop a programme for working class political power, for what I would call workers' government, which had the effect of kind of abandoning the political terrain to a sort of right-wing Labour leadership. So that idea, the idea I just mentioned, the idea of workers' government, a government that will govern as a partisan for our class, as explicitly as the Tories govern as partisans for the rich, can be thought of as the apex of what I'd call a transitional programme, which is an old-fashioned idea, which I think is still very serviceable in terms of how socialists should think about our politics. And the purpose of a transitional programme isn't, contrary to the sort of vulgar conception of it that one often encounters on the left, the purpose of it isn't to raise demands that are unrealisable under capitalism and which fighting for and failing to win will sort of cause the reformist scales to miraculously fall from workers' eyes. Rather, the purpose of a transitional approach is to find demands which can build a bridge or act as the next link in the chain, as Lenin once put it, between immediate struggles and the revolutionary transformation of society. And in a sort of immediate sense, that might involve doing things like forming ad hoc cross-union local strike committees. Sure. Richard comes from a kind of particular tradition that likes to talk about councils of action at every possible opportunity. I wouldn't use that terminology exactly, but I think maybe there's some shared perspective in terms of seeing a need for local cross-union kind of strike committees that attempt to coalesce and cohere some of those forces. So I'm nearly out of time, but I think one thing we might discuss is what the elements of, if there are people in the room who think that kind of transitional approach is worthwhile, what the elements of that programme might be. I'd suggest that policies like public ownership of all utilities and services, including banking and finance, and the complete abolition of all legal restrictions on the right to organise and strike are two that I would argue need to be particularly central. So, look, very finally, I think winning even sections of the movement to that kind of transitional approach and the perspective of a workers' government is some way off, and the current wave will almost certainly recede, but before it is won. But whilst the very meagre forces of the revolutionary left in this country can't determine the outcome of the current moment sort of at will, I think we can make a difference to it. And I think if we intervene in our workplaces and unions on the basis of the perspective I've tried to sketch here, so for rank and file independence in thought and action, for transitional demands that draw out the political implications of disputes, and as the apex of that, the idea of a workers' government as the labour movement's governmental alternative to Tory government of the rich for the rich, then I think we give ourselves the best possible chance of at least making some advances rather than being set back. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Richard.
So what's the missing element in what Daniel just said? If you want to have a government, what do you need to have? You need to have an organisation that is committed to fighting for political power. An organisation of a class that struggles for political power, that sets the goal as being the establishment of a government of the working class, which will then act unconstrained by any law to dispossess the ruling class and hold it down so that it can't get its property and its power back, using whatever dictatorial measures are required against the former ruling class. Yeah? How can you do that without a political party? What is a political party? A political party is just the term that we use for an organisation that strives for political power. So the absolutely critical component, if we're going to go from a situation of mass strikes and mass rebellion in a situation of really pervasive crisis, not just in Britain but around the world, we have to advance towards a political party. And what Marxists in any country where such a party does not exist are supposed to be doing is organising for the independence of the working class, and that is synonymous with the organisation of the most advanced sections of the class, which means that the sections that are in struggle, into a political party. How do we form such a party? Well, the traditional methods adopted by the left in Britain, and in many other countries as well, I have to say, are twofold. One is to attempt to take over a bourgeois institution. That method always fails. The other method is to say, I've got a nice party here, a new party. The cargo cult method of building a party, where you set it up on the sidelines, you have a logo, you have membership forms, and you say, come and join our party, and our programme is very good, and it's different from that other party, but you should join us. And you recruit ones and twos, and you lose threes and fours, and you spend an awful lot of time fussing about those ones and twos, and it's not a party. It's not a party. But there is another method, and one of the questions was about historical examples that we can draw on, and that is the example of the formation of the German social democracy. Okay, we know how it ended, but they did build a mass party, and it could have ended differently if that mass party, right, had adopted a different path. But without a mass party, they would have got nowhere near as far. Ditto with the Russian social democracy. I'm not one for disparaging the efforts of the Russian Social Democrats. As Daniel has already suggested, I'm quite keen on taking historical analogies and trying to make them a reality. Also in terms of the high points of the British struggle, such as the organisation of the councils of action in the 1920s. You'll have great difficulties securing victory in a general strike if you leave it in the hands of the TUC, and therefore local organisations that bring together workers, whatever you call them, need to be organised. But without a political party, then we will never take the power. Now, how do we do that? We have to go to all of the organisations and layers of workers that are moving into struggle with a formation of Marxists that agitates in favour of a credible process to jointly design, among all of those forces, a party. That means that the programme is something which we discuss with them, a draft that we discuss with them, a process that we draw people into in order to develop a political programme. Where there are disputes and arguments about among the Marxists, we have them in context in relation to what their actual consequences are for our conduct in the class struggle. When we design the form of the party, we do that as a political question as well. But first we have to go among the various sectors that are in struggle, and who are they? Well, there's 700,000 people that signed that enough is enough thing, and apart from being asked to be bums on seats, they haven't been mobilised. 100,000 and above signed up to Don't Pay. 200,000 left the Labour Party in disgust, and they're not all idiots. Yeah. There's also scores of thousands in struggle all over the country now. Now, if Corbyn revealed one thing, it's that even if you have a left reformist leader of the Labour Party, you can't take over the Labour Party. So let's forget about trying to take over the Labour Party. That doesn't mean I'm saying to Kevin, walk out now, because I want you to organise and take as many people with you when they come for you. But do what they did in Newham when they come for you. Don't do what they did in Camberwell and Peckham. In Newham, they came for them, and Newham said, we are not going to dissolve, you cannot have our officers, we are going to stick together, and they formed a breakaway organisation, which has then organised a large Enough is Enough and food banks, and is organising. Ditto in Leicester, where there are some of them are in the Labour Party, some of them are out of the Labour Party, but they work together around it. Don't do what they did in my area, in Camberwell and Peckham, which is say, OK, we'll elect a new secretary of our Labour Party branch on the sole policy of not doing anything to get ourselves suspended from the Labour Party, which is not a programme of action that can advance the working class in any meaningful way, and is in fact a white flag of surrender. Don't do that. Now, where's that going to leave you? Kevin, it's going to leave you outside the Labour Party. Right? So we're going to need to bring forces together in, as I say, a credible process for the formation of a party, and that is how the Marxists formed a party in Germany, and that is how the Marxists formed a party in Russia. What political basis, right, do you establish for it? That is a matter of struggle, which means that the Marxists need to conduct that argument. We need to advance a Marxist policy, a Marxist strategy. We need to saturate the movement with propaganda, not just agitation, propaganda for the doctrine and the strategy and the tactics and the programme and the method of Marxism. And for that, we don't need a sect. We need to be advocating the formation of a party. We need to be advocating unity and action at local level. And we need a working class media centre that can saturate the movement with the ideas of Marxism in context as we attempt to organise and direct the movement towards a real challenge for political power.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. So we are now going to head on to the Q&A. As the privilege of moderating, I'm going to take this opportunity to pose one of mine to each of the panelists, and then I will take individual hands. So actually, when we were organizing this, panel, we really wanted to bring on an individual from one of the anarchist movements. So actually, about 2 weeks ago, I was in this room in a panel organized by the ACG. Oh, good lord. There we go. Woo. Nice, nice. Okay. Woo. So 2 weeks. Yeah, those are the anarchists haunting me. So I was in a panel held by the ACG with representatives from Don't Pay, RS21, Don't Pay, RS21, and the Angry Workers, right? And we reached out to both Don't Pay and the Angry Workers for representatives, see if anyone would participate. I just didn't have enough. We didn't have enough time. They didn't have enough time. I just didn't. But I think what I wanted to try to do is kind of pose a question in this spirit. So and actually respond a little bit to Daniel's criticism, which is welcome, about why it's called the Enough is Enough in the left. So I think one of the things that was interesting to me that was posted in this previous panel held by the ACG was that the organizers from Don't Pay described themselves as the practical response to a crisis, and that the enough is enough was the political response, filling a political vacuum. Where in the face of the Tory party, we're electing new leaders, seems stagnant on the issue. And there is this kind of skepticism, maybe healthy skepticism about enough is enough, as maybe the foremost kind of visibly political organizing point for the left in the UK to bring these disputes to the public. And what they counterposed one of the critiques was that, its affiliations with the Labour Party, which had recently, within the past 5-7 years, liquidated a lot of the youthful energy and historical experience of the left, rendering it very weak, come the end of Corbynism, right? Everyone seems to be in this kind of contemplative kind of space of what actually those Corbyn years meant in terms of organizing on the left, leftist politics. And the Don't Pay campaign, as well as the work that the angry workers do, is a kind of way to bring socialist action directly from the workers without any interference from the Labour Party, right? So I guess one of the questions I would ask on this term is, what a new form of politics, both away from the Labour Party as well as from the tradition of Marxism, and then actually prioritizing kind of not only workers' councils but also community councils, right? So the idea is that you have a neighborhood chapter of Don't Pay, which can then, it's about not paying your energy bill, but there are ideas that you can then scale it up to do other community-based projects. Would this not be a better opportunity for independent workers' politics? I think I'll leave that one there. So for the ramble at the beginning.
Are you taking a few questions at once?
Nope,
or?
one at a time.
Okay.
Daniel, do you want to respond first?
Sorry, just to ask before you go on, was that you clarifying what you took away from the Don't Pay campaign meeting that you visited last week?
Yes, and I'm trying to. So the question I asked was, along the lines of like, what can politics, or the idea of a political party, or I can maybe put it in a more Marxist way, right? We recently read the 18th Brumaire in our platypus reading group, where it reasserts, from the beginning, the necessity, or Marx's kind of political clarification, or the lessons learned from 1848 was the necessity for a politically organized working class party and movement. Yeah. So what an kind of anarchisty, or I would say isty, because I don't want to directly subscribe what this is about or what I'm trying to embody. But the perspective would be like a political party is actually a distraction and actually an old form which we've tried to replicate for the past 150 years and has failed every time. And why still defend the form of an independent socialist party or defend the form of an association with the Labour Party?
Okay. Well, I think firstly I would contest the idea that it's failed every time, because any moment of meaningful kind of confrontation with the question of power on the part of a working class movement, any of the moments we might want to talk about, Russian Revolution, Spain 1936, they end in defeat, and we can kind of pick apart and analyse those defeats. But to even have got to the point of potential that those movements got to, they had a party at their core, including, the anarchists had a party in Spain in 1936 called the FAI, and they can swear up and down that it's not a party and that they're against the party form. Nonsense. Like at every historic high point for anarchist politics, there was a party type organisation at the centre of that. So, even in terms of their own tradition, I think the idea that they represent a kind of hyper novel break from the necessity of the party form, or the necessity of a political party type organisation, doesn't really withstand historical scrutiny. And the fact that the panel that you were attending was organised by the ACG, that is a small p anarchist political party. Small p. I stress the distinction, but it is. So, no is the short answer. I don't think we can kind of do away with the need for a party type organisation. Now, there's obviously a big discussion to be had, and I suspect even on this panel probably quite a lot of disagreement about the type of party and how it should be organised, and I think certainly how it comes into being. But I think there probably is agreement around the idea that a formal political organisation is necessary, and it isn't good enough to organise either through just expecting industrial militancy to kind of carry you forward on its own logic, or community militancy of the sort of don't pay type, without the need for explicit politics. The last thing, just to say a word about the Labour Party. For me, this is just a question of like facing the world around you as it exists, right? Like the Labour Party is a kind of fact of Labour movement political life in this country, and even if you're somebody who wants to see it split apart and be broken from and be superseded by a revolutionary or even a kind of class struggle social democratic party of some sort, I think the path to that lies through sort of insurgent struggle within it, rather than attempt to go around it. Now, I know Richard wasn't exactly, you weren't going for the kind of, in fact you explicitly critiqued the sort of, let's just set up a new party and say that's the alternative to Labour kind of approach. Nevertheless, look, I think there is no path to a better form of working class political or independent working class political representation in this country that doesn't lie through insurgent struggle in the existing one. So I don't think it's a terrain that socialists can really avoid.
Richard?
Well, we just had that, and it lost, and there is still the need for a party. And anybody who thinks that the right wing of the Labour Party haven't learned a very important lesson from the experience of 2015 to 2019 hasn't been watching what has happened since, which is that the right wing have determined that they are never, ever going to allow the other key institution of the stability of British capitalism, the Labour Party, to be undermined by the left again. The left failed because they thought, right, foolishly, that they were in some way going to win an election and form a government in alliance with the right wing of the Labour Party and institute a series of pro-worker reforms and reforms that supported the oppressed. What a ridiculous idea. What an illusion. What bankruptcy that was. They would never have allowed it to happen, and even if the Labour Party had won the election, the Parliamentary Labour Party would have chosen a new leader overnight and the Queen would have invited them to form a government, and that would have been that. Right? And even if Corbyn had ruled, then he would either have done a Syriza or a Lula or an Allende, but one way or another, right, they would not have instituted socialism. But most likely, right, is what actually happened, which was an ignominious defeat as a result of failing to stick to their principles and fight, failing to take their ideas adequately into the working class when they ran contrary to the main line of bourgeois ideology at the given moment, and then not drawing the lessons. Why would anybody say, no, the path has to be through the Labour Party? Possibly venality, because they want to be a councillor or an MP, or they already are. Possibly a lack of imagination, or possibly because they do not have any clear strategy for establishing the independence of the working class in Britain. No clear strategy. Now, the FAI was not a party, nor is the Anarchist Communist Group. And why? Because they're not organisations that are striving for political power, but also, in the case of the Anarchist Communist Group, right, because it lacks any sort of mass that would enable it to struggle for power. Where Daniel is right is the FAI was an analogue in the anarchist movement of what the Marxists had in the form of political parties and sects. But it wasn't a political party, not only because it did not fight for power. In fact, it opposed the idea of the left parties actually fighting for political power. The Friends of Durruti may have realised in their own way that it was necessary to form some sort of proletarian dictatorship, but I would argue that at that point they by definition broke with anarchism, because it is a fundamental precept of anarchism that we must not take political power, that we somehow have to dissolve political power without, to my mind, having the wherewithal to actually dissolve it. Because you can't just dissolve it from the ground up, you need the central organisation and direction of the smashing and dismantling of the capitalist state and the centralised suppression of the exploiters. How can you get that? You can't get it without a mass working class movement. You can't get it without the strike movement that Daniel's talking about. You can't get it without workers linking up at local level. You can't get it without any of those things. And as Kevin says, those things won't spontaneously turn into a recognition of the political tasks. It's the task of Marxists in the process of organising the fight back, also to organise a party and to commit a party to that perspective. Now, let's just talk about failure for a moment and what conclusions we draw from failure. If we were to say that every moment in class struggle that ended in failure should be abandoned, then we abandon not only Marxism but also anarchism. We abandon trade unionism. We abandon political organisation. We abandon every lesson from every historical moment in the class struggle. We abandon class struggle and we abandon hope. Because all we would be doing is observing that the class struggle has not yet been completed and we haven't won yet. What we have to do, I'm afraid, is look at each moment, each institution, each historical event, each concept, and analyse whether its failures were contingent, subjective, or baked in to the wrongness of the whole idea. Yeah, and that's what we have to do in each case. And I would say, therefore, that the idea that you can create a mass party through individual recruitment to a sect, is the failure of that is baked in, just as the failure of capturing bourgeois institutions and turning them into working class ones is baked in. Yeah? But what is not baked in is the idea that a party itself can conduct itself in such a way as to bring the working class to power and avoid degeneration. Of course, we'll have to find out for ourselves what the mechanics of that will be in the course of the class struggle. We can't assure ourselves of the outcome a priori. If we were able to do that, then it would just demonstrate that we hadn't quite understood that the independent action of the enemy is also a factor, and you can't know exactly what they're going to do, and also that Marxism doesn't provide us with a looking glass that tells us exactly what is going to happen. It's a science, not a dogma. But we do know that there are certain things that have been proven to be absolutely, irreducibly essential in the course of the class struggle, and that is that we have a theory, that is that we have industrial and workplace organisation, and that is that we have a political party. It's also very clear that we're going to have to fight in the more direct meaning of the term as well.
Kevin?
I suppose just 2 points. One is to respond to your anarchist interlocutors the other week. I think they do implicitly have a political project. It's just that they hide it behind non-politics, and the same will be true of the Don't Pay campaign or Enough is Enough. So what you often get with all forms of spontaneous organisation are, I think, politics. It's just that they're not explicit. And that's certainly true, I think, with things like Don't Pay. Daniel raised a series of transitional demands around public ownership of resources and dealing with the energy crisis. Groups like that will possibly shy away from them in the terms of them being political, and even to sort of counter through a protest campaign. The poll tax is one I remember as well, which is often cited. was very much the product of political groups. It was very much a product of that sort of activity. These things are very rarely spontaneous, and I think that they inevitably raise political questions, which anarchists I think should recognise that. I think the history of much of the sort of movement politics that we've had since the 1990s has sort of thrown that up, and it's very rarely either built successful campaigns or indeed very sustained ones. That enough is enough and so on are they have a certain mass character. I'm on the list as well. They are areas in which we can intervene. They're areas of struggle, but that requires some sort of political perspective, not, I think, the sort of rather aimless coming together of amorphous forces. So I think that is really quite a fundamental difference between us and anarchists, or at least my part of the left in that way. On the party question that Richard throws up, I had sketched actually out quite a few of those points before coming, and I intended to bring them in. I think that one of the central problems that we have is not just the existence of Labour, but of Labourism, and I think that many of the existing left groups do either in terms of their demands or in terms of their practice do tend to put forward the type of perspective that Richard says, which is some sort of left Labour government. The CPB's British Road to Socialism is probably the sort of ultimate of that. But even on focusing on the need to elect a Labour government and to make that your central activity, and then say to put pressure on it, I think John Rees recently, in a discussion with one of my comrades one of the broader comrades from Liverpool, Audrey White, said about voting for Starmer and putting Starmer into power and then putting pressure on him in that way. And that's a misunderstanding of the nature of the Labour Party. And again, I'm not going to go over the same ground as Richard, because I think there's probably substantial agreement with us on that. But I do think perhaps one area of difference, which isn't to say that Labour, we should cling on to Labour at all costs, but it is to take the point that Daniel makes about Labour exists, Labourism exists, and that I think is one of our central areas to fight. We have to challenge that politically. That the battle is not just against capitalism, but for Marxists, it's against those sorts of politics, particularly the idea that the state machine can be utilised in that way, that socialism can be achieved through a series of piecemeal reforms. But I think that the Labour Party does have a future, or a possible future, and this is where I suppose the idea of crisis comes in, and that is that Labour is, to use the old cliche, the other party of British capitalism, but it's also a party which has its roots in the trade union movement, and I still think that through that, and also through other forms of political action, you could see movements occurring through the Labour Party. I'm not talking about the immediate revival of Corbynism. I'm just saying, not to rule it out. The attacks that the Labour right have launched on the left, the controls that they have over the party machine. I mean, Liverpool is now virtually a sort of one-man system with the party officials controlling all appointments at all levels and suspension of meetings and so forth. So I understand all of that, but there is still, I think, a possibility that Labour can be a battleground again. But I don't see Labour being transformed. I still think that our aim as Marxists is the creation of a Marxist party. I agree, not a sect, and I also agree one that arises from really the fullest discussion, not the sort of here's my program, please, you have to accept all. In fact, not please, here it is, take it or leave it, clear off. So I think discussions like this and discussions such as we've had in Liverpool, do point that way forward. I am a member of the SLN. You know, a number of my comrades are as well. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I don't tell everybody the organisation I'm a member.
SLN?
Socialist Labour Network.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm also a member of the Merseyside Pensioners, but I don't. Yeah.
They wear the badge.
Well, actually, they're about the most militant group on Merseyside. Yeah. We were the ones who did the stunt with Keir Starmer.
Excellent.
Yeah. But the serious point, I think, is that to me the question revolves around the question of the party, and it also arose around that quite fundamental question for socialists and for Marxists, and indeed for anybody who claims to be on the left, the issue of how we develop that socialist consciousness. You know, where and how do we conduct that struggle, and the sort of demands that are going to do that. So I think that's an area that I would focus on in the discussion. And the failure of the left, I think, has often been to limit its struggles to economic struggles and not, for example, raise those bigger questions of power. Richard did that, I think, quite effectively in terms of the state. And of course, if we're looking at the state and labourism, you know, labourism is an intrinsic part of the state, and that's where I think our battles have to begin.
Thank you very much. Okay, everybody. I would ask that you keep your questions as concise as possible, or as possible, like, you know, say what you have to say, and to introduce yourself when you ask your question. So I will be taking them. Hands up. Any questions from the audience? Okay, we'll start with you.
Hi. I'm Tom from Platypus. I guess this isn't a trick question. I promise you. This is just a sort of plea for you to educate us, because I think I'm still remain a little confused about your respective relationships to the Labour Party. And I'm sorry I know you've spoken a lot about the Labour Party, but I just don't quite understand what it means to be a Labour Party Marxist or to be in the Socialist Labour Network, given some of the things you've said today. Daniel, I maybe understand a little better what your project might be. And I guess, and to extend that question a little bit, would be to ask how those convictions have changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and what might be the prospects for the next 5, 6, 7 years, just to borrow the sort of periodization someone brought up earlier. What could become of the Labour Party as an obstacle and as an opportunity?
Okay, cool. Kevin,
Well, I'll respond to that. I won't go too much into my personal journey, which is actually a little longer than 6 or 7 years. But I joined the Labour Party in 1970, partly for family reasons. I come from, a Labour Party family, but a left Labour Party family, which is actually tinged with Trotskyism, and I don't use that phrase sort of loosely. People who were members of organised Trotskyist groups in the 40s and 50s. So in many ways, I had the perspective up to a point that Richard has criticised, which is that for want of anything else, for want of any sort of revolutionary group, I was in the Labour Party and I would sort of agitate there for sort of left positions. The groups that I would have been sort of closest to probably would have been various tendencies in the IMG and even militant on some things. So that, that's where I would have been for quite a long time. I lived in quite small places in Yorkshire and Lancashire, well away from the big cities. So the politics of the 70s and 80s for me were more around sort of industrial struggles against cuts. So for example, the London Labour left was something which you read about in the papers, but it never quite percolated up into West Yorkshire, or to the parts of. So my arrival at this position was really the failure of organism, and I recognised in quite a lot of people who joined the Labour Party, who came back in, Many of them were of my generation in Liverpool, for example. It would be wrong to say that it was a sort of a youth movement. In fact, if anything, it was in some senses, you know, as the phrase in Liverpool was, militant with the bus pass. You know, so in a way, a lot of people came back with all the old politics.
Yes.
You know, and it was quite funny to hear people coming out with slogans that I'd last heard in about 1975. Although socialist appeals do say them or have said them as well, it's always a trip down memory lane sometimes to talk to comrades in that way. But my point is what I arrived at was that the idea of sort of transforming the Labour Party sort of bit by bit, you know, getting 500,000 people into it, who were all committed on the left, was going to fail, partly because of the organisational structure, but also I think, and you know, I say this to a certain extent because at this point I was still part of these politics. People didn't realise the nature of the battle they were getting into, and in particular, the Labour left has you hear this cliche, you know, that you know the Labour Party is like a bird that needs two wings to fly. You know, which used to be a nice way of saying, look, the left's quite legitimate in this party. Well, actually, I was increasingly the opinion that the left shouldn't be legitimate in the Labour Party because it isn't a party that you want to be legitimate in. Exactly. But quite a lot of my comrades, I'm using that in the sense of people who were in the left tendencies in the Labour Party, you know, were quite sort of happy to see the Labour Party in that way. So their failure to seriously take the battle to the Labour right, you know, was I think not just the leadership and the official left. It was also true of many of the people at the grassroots, and that was, I think, because their project was not one of building any sort of revolutionary movement. Now I then began to move towards the position of, you know, distinctive revolutionary party. One which, you know, to a certain extent, I shied away from, you know, for much of my life. I'm sorry if this sounds very confessional, but I'm actually describing an experience I went through, and you know, it was, I think, quite important to suddenly realise that the things that you'd been thinking, well, they aren't going to happen. And you know, Corbynism was probably about the best opportunity. You know, my constituency Labour Party went from 800 to 1,800 in a matter of, you know, months. But when we started to, you know, really confront the right,
was that a good thing? I'm just interested.
Well, it was a good thing in the sense that these were people who identified as socialists. You know, it meant that there were people you could now debate with. And the point was, what I think became increasingly clear was that they were confined within Labourism, and I suppose this is the danger of seeing or posing Labour as merely a site for struggle. So the position that Labour Party Marxists hold is essentially that Labour, you know, agitationally we can talk about refounding it as a united front. But our clear point now must be a Marxist party, in other words, a separate Marxist formation, and that the way that we might deal with that organisationally is, for example, the refoundation of Labour as a united front open to all socialist and working class organisations. In other words, its sort of original formation until it settled by around about 1905, 1906. Now, we don't think we can avoid the Labour Party either dealing with its politics, and I think that's the central thing, but so we can't ignore it, and Labourism is the problem, but I think that we also can't magic up a party out of nowhere. And the history of, say, the Communist Party in Britain in the very early 20s also shows how it does arrive out of particular struggles and out of particular forms. So I would say that our position is clearly towards the building of a Marxist party, but not simply saying, well, Labour is irrelevant. It's not. It's a very important force, and it has, I think, a distinctive character. In terms of its future, and I'll just finish on this, apologies for speaking too long, I think, but it is conceivable that, for example, the current Labour coalition of the unions and sections of the Labour left and the right and so on could fracture. Indeed, it's possible that Starmer could complete Blair's project of breaking from the trade unions, and that might then give, I think, Labour something of a different character. Likewise, also, if there is any sort of electoral reform, I very much doubt that's likely to occur, but that might open up spaces for left currents. I mean, the Newham example that Richard refers to was if we look at the local campaigning there, I think that does show some forces that might emerge. But at the moment, I think they're very disparate. They're very demoralised. The Labour left is very demoralised, very disorganised, and I think very confused. So I'm sorry, that was a long, rather more personal reply than I would have done normally.
Thank you, Kevin. Richard?
Yeah, so Kevin has given something of a sort of individual confessional, and the family that I grew up with is more a tradition of collective atonement. So I'll talk about things slightly less personally. Though I will say that I've sort of tried to be a Leninist and a Trotskyist since about 1983, 1984. And therefore, for me, the idea that the Labour Party is a bourgeois workers' party, and we can talk about dialectics in a minute, has always been an important thing since I got involved in the movement. And an institution, therefore, that needs to be broken up if working class independence is to be established. I don't think the Labour Party is irrelevant at all. I think it is one of the key props of British capitalism. I think we've got to get it out of the way, and I think when we form a party, we'll have to continue to fight it, and that's why we need a party to contest the control of the labour and trade union bureaucracy over the working class, politically, industrially and organisationally. And that's why we need to bring a new party into being. And I think, there have been numerous schemers around the Labour Party. Militants' idea that we're going to take over the Labour Party, elect a Labour government, use an enabling act and expropriate the top 200 monopolies. The Communist Party's idea that we'd have a left-wing Labour government which would then form an alliance with the Communist Party and pursue essentially the same approach. And the idea that the Labour Party under Corbyn, we were going to flood into it, we were going to build a social movement, we were going to create a left-wing government. These are all illusions. But let's not come up with an even more rarefied schema of trying to re-establish the conditions that the Communist Party faced when it was formed, forcibly by the Comintern pretty much, in 1920 by compelling the British sects against their own disposition to merge with one another under the leadership of the Communist International, which is how the Communist Party was formed here in 1920, and imagine that what we're going to do is create that and its relationship to a somehow more benign, earlier stage, less encrusted, less bourgeoisified Labour Party, which it can influence in some form of careful alliance. And we'll have the Marxist Party here, and we'll have a united front, slightly less nasty Labour Party here, and that's a fantasy. That is a schema as well, trying to reproduce conditions that we recognise. Let's recognise one thing only, that our priority is the construction of a party, and a party involves, therefore, the bringing together, right, of real forces to discuss how we might combine in order to fight for power, and that the Marxists have to champion that process in order to establish the moral and political capital to be able to influence its programme, its tactics, its operations, its organisation. That is a task of organisation and agitation as well as propaganda, and that is what we have to do. My relationship to the Labour Party has therefore been one of antagonism since I became a Marxist. Sometimes I've been in it, sometimes I haven't been in it, but when I have been in it, it's in the expectation that I'll get disciplined and thrown out, and in the hope that when that happens, we'll take people with us. The reason that didn't happen between 2015 and 2019 was the absence of a sizable Marxist association capable of giving a lead in that context and confronting and overcoming the prejudices and the groupthink and the bullshit that we saw on the Labour left at that time, both inside and outside of the party. But we are where we are. And one of the places where we are is that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have left the Labour Party, and some of whom are so embittered by their experience that they are now, I personally couldn't bring myself to vote for Starmer. Therefore, I don't want a general election. Therefore, I'm not going on the Enough is Enough, on the People's Assembly demonstration, which I know Platypus did go on because I saw your banner and I toyed with the idea of going up and saying hello and I was too shy. But
So did Jeremy Corbyn.
and also, exactly. Also, I thought they would just, meet you tonight. But and there's that overreaction, isn't there? And it's going to be very difficult, therefore, to try to dispel some of those ideas and get people on the right path. Socialist Labour Network is not a Marxist vanguard organisation. It's not democratic centralist. It doesn't have a programme. It doesn't have discipline. Its age profile, it would accept, is awful. But what do we have? Well, it's real. There's 700 people. They're all over the country. We discuss issues. We did adopt a policy of calling for building, united, enough is enough, stroke don't pay, stroke People's Assembly, stroke whatever you want to call them things. And we called them action councils because that was the easiest term, and also perhaps the age profile meant people recognised what it meant as well. And also, frankly, because that is the high point of the tradition of organisation, and we are in favour of a party. We have launched an appeal which is going to go online shortly. It's supposed to be going online today, asking people to, sign up to the idea of this, and then start to organise, I don't know, clubs or unions or associations or initiatives in favour of it around the country. But within that, if a spinal column of conscious Marxists don't associate themselves and push this forwards, then even if it succeeds, it will fail, if you see what I mean. I'll leave the question of the Bourgeois Workers' Party until later, because that's obviously also a concept which is widely misunderstood, but I haven't got time.
Do you want to go back to the floor?
Yeah, sure thing. Who have we got? Hello. If you could say your name.
Okay, my name is Jonathan Silverman. I'm a member of the Communist League. And it'd be lovely to have the opportunity to have the same amount of time to explain our views, and I won't be able to do that in posing a question. But what I'm getting from the people on the platform is that they're part of the left, or they either feel themselves part of the left or feel that they have something more in common with the left, or people identify themselves as socialists, as you would put it. But I confess that the left has absolutely nothing to do with working class politics. Big state welfareism. I mean, I'm just thinking of the Corbyn thing, which I guess you all think was a positive development. Big state welfareism, anti-Semitism, covering up for Russia and China in world politics, cancel culture and other attacks on democratic rights. These are the vanguard. That has nothing to do with communism. And Marx would have, Marx was trying to build a working class movement. He was recruited to the League of the Just. He fought for a program. Lenin, give me an organization of revolutionists and I will overturn Russia. It was fundamentally programmatic, fundamentally, from the get-go. We are very much in the tradition of Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, people who in the case of Marx, he didn't do a revolution, but Lenin and Trotsky did, and Fidel and Che did. And And you have to start from world politics and world economics and the history of the international class struggle. The Labour Party is not a Labour Party. It'd be great if there was a Labour Party in this country, but the sort of conditions that gave rise to what was a Labour Party were giant working class struggles. Giant working class struggles, which allowed a striving for political independence by workers from the choice between liberals and the Tories. That will happen again, and that will give conditions. There is no strike wave now, my goodness. I agree that the low point of union fights is behind us. And it's great that for the last 25, 30 years, but there's no strike wave. When I was organising strikes, you went on strike, and you didn't go back to work until either you won or you decided you couldn't win or whatever it was, and one day here, one day, that's not a strike wave. But at a time, there will be giant working class struggles. That's the lesson of history. And under giant working class struggles, there will be a possibility of breaking from capitalist politics and establishing a mass party of labour. And it will be done under union, in a country like Britain, under union impulse. There is no way out of that. But, right now, the task is to do what Lenin started to do in 1900. In the early years of the 20th century, and what the Comintern did, by the way, which was the first 5 congresses, were the vanguard. What they did in the Communist Party was made up of a bunch of sectarians, I agree with you. But the fact that Lenin and the Bolsheviks insisted in this country, in the United States, they should unite and form a party was brilliant. Absolutely. And I stand completely in that tradition. And we need to... Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Build parties like Lenin and the Bolsheviks. If we do that with a program that was advanced by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the first 4 congresses of the Comintern, and I agree with one thing I did agree with Daniel, and the transitional program, great, but the left, what's the left got to do with that?
Daniel, could I?
Well, I think just as you felt yourself constrained by time in making your point, I'm not sure I'll have the opportunity to say everything I would want to say in response to that. Proclaiming that what the left needs to do is to do what Lenin did and build a party like the Bolsheviks. Sure, I agree with that. I'm a Bolshevik. I identify with the Bolshevik tradition. But you might say that, I might say that, and for example, the fact that you consider yourself to be part of a discrete tradition that includes Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara suggests that we probably have slightly different conceptions of what that tradition is. So when we talk about acting as the Bolsheviks did, we might mean slightly different things by that. Guess I wanted to maybe use your comments as a sort of jumping off point to say a couple of things about the experience of Corbynism. Where I perhaps do agree with you is that I think it's true that there were some subjective political failings within the kind of political DNA of that movement, and I'm sure this is not a view that will be shared by my fellow panelists, that meant that kind of contributed to a lot of its potential going unrealised. Political failings over, I think, issues like Brexit, over anti-Semitism. I know that will definitely be controversial on the panel, but yes, over anti-Semitism in my view, and the kind of campist approach to sort of international politics that you referred to as well. That's all factored in the mix. But I think for me, the key failing of the sort of experience of Corbynism, and I think it's something that's been kind of intimated by comments that others have made, was the hegemonic view within that sort of moment that what that moment was about was sort of one more push and we'll get Jeremy into number 10 and that'll be that. And you know, some people maybe had a slightly more insurgent conception of that and thought, that that's going to lead to that will lead to struggles. And some people maybe had a slightly more naive conception of that, where they thought, Jeremy will get into number 10 and then we'll have socialism. But whatever about those differences, the kind of hegemonic view of the sort of Corbyn project, the Corbyn moment, was that that's what we need to do, and that's the role for people in this movement. As much door knocking as you can. In fact, very much replicated the sort of apolitical New Labour approach to electoral politics, which was sort of data crunching, and because it was all about one more push, Jeremy's in number 10, jobs are good un. And what that completely left out of the fatally left out of the picture is that any serious socialist movement inside the Labour Party does have to see itself in insurgent oppositional terms, and the Labour Party is not something that can be taken over wholesale. And in fact, in a way, it sort of misses the point to critique Corbynism on the basis that it tried to take over the Labour Party, and that can't be, because actually it didn't try.
That's a fair point.
That was a big part of its downfall, really, is that it actually sort of consciously avoided those kind of confrontations from the get-go. Why the machine was left, avoided a confrontation over mandatory reselection, avoided any kind of confrontation over attempting to democratise the sort of bureaucracy. So the machine was kind of entirely left intact. And I think the lesson that needs to be drawn from that, I think I have very significant sort of differences of emphasis and perspective from the other two panelists. So although there's maybe a superficial similarity in some of what I'm about to say, I think that there are some significant differences under that. Nevertheless, I do think that a key sort of lesson from that experience is that the aim of socialist Marxist intervention and activity in the Labour Party as a terrain has to be thought of as insurgent and oppositional, rather than something that's about attempting to accommodate or that sees the Labour Party as something that can be kind of captured wholesale. And at various points, kind of Corbynism sort of bounce between those sort of two ideas, the idea of kind of accommodation and then the sort of thinking that, if we can kind of get Jeremy into number 10, that'll be it. And it's led to an enormous amount of demoralisation and kind of diffusion, so definitely a lesson to be learnt there.
Any other responses?
Sure. So, in the US, left might include liberals, but it doesn't here and it doesn't in Europe. Left means the working class movement and political organisations associated with the working class, and the right means the organisations associated with the mainstream of the bourgeois political establishment, and the centre means bourgeois liberalism. The populist parties' position in relation to those fundamental fundamental taxonomy of modern bourgeois democratic politics, and therefore, if that's what the left means, then I'm of the left, and if it's not, then I'm not. And I have no further interest in that subject. What I am interested in, though, is the question of where we start methodologically, and I agree with Jonathan, who I first met in 1983 when I was at the Young Workers' Assembly, and he was slightly too old to be there, but he made a brilliant speech from the floor about Ireland, which was a topic that had been glossed over by the organisers, and there was a rebellion in Ireland at the time, and it was an excellent contribution. And since then, I think I've seen you about twice in my life. And I agree that we start analytically, methodologically, from world economy and world politics when we analyse situations. And then we must proceed from that to an analysis of the domestic conditions. We need to understand the polity, not as in a vulgar way, as simply reading it off from economic and class relations, but also understand the constellations of interests that are being corralled into political parties, and understand how they act in a particular conjuncture and how they interact. That means that the basis of a Marxist analysis is an understanding of all of the classes in society, not only in abstracto, through an understanding of what their fundamental characteristics are, but also concretely in understanding what the historical conjuncture has brought them to, what they are trying to achieve, what their contradictions and weaknesses are, and how we can exploit them. And that also means we have to zero in on the weaknesses of our own class, and I will not tire of repeating, and now the Plummies decided to applaud me, that the absence of a political party of the workers in any given country, right, becomes the priority that the Marxists in that country must address. You pointed out that that is stated by Marx in the 18th Brumaire. It's stated by Engels in relation to the German and the British situation repeatedly. It's stated by Eleanor Marx in her polemics with Hyndman, where she argued that what was necessary was not a sect, but the organisation of a mass party. Plekhanov advanced it against the populists in the early years of Russian Marxists. Lenin argued it in his arguments against the Narodniks and the emerging SR party, when he argued that a workers' party was needed, and that it would not be a sect because it would be defined by its tasks, and because it would embed itself in real struggles in order to promote strikes, promote workers' organisation, to do so legally and illegally, and attempt to bring groups like the St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, like the South Russian Workers' Union that Trotsky and others were organising in Kherson and Mykolaiv and other towns and cities that are in the press at the moment for different reasons, like the Bund, like the people around the Rabochya Mizl newspaper that was the only printing press that the Russian Marxists had at the time. They didn't agree on every issue, but they were to be brought together in a political party. And I agree with Jonathan. The Communist International was right to force the warring sects in Britain to come together. And obviously they set down 21 points for affiliation to the Comintern, which were very clear and very revolutionary, and they had the authority and the scale in the international movement to do so, and they needed to do so in order to organise people that were breaking from international social democracy into a force that would actually fight for revolution and defend the workers' states, the workers' state in Russia, rather than equivocate on those questions. But the sad fact is that the Communist Party, thus formed in 1920, had 2,000 members. Trotsky was right when he argued that it was never really a party, it was nothing more than a propaganda society. And so it remained. This is why Lenin also insisted it would need to develop tactics towards the Labour Party at that time, with the goal, clearly, of splitting the Labour Party, just as the Comintern's supporters attempted, and in many cases succeeded, in splitting the mass social democratic parties in other countries around the world, and then consolidating around a revolutionary perspective, not through ukase from above, not through diktat, but through persuasion, until the Fifth Congress came along and started to supplant democratic struggle for leadership with the ultimatist policies of the Zinoviev Comintern, and we know how that all ended up. So those are the things that we need to be focused on today, not as an historical reenactment society, but because we do have real forces. I don't agree with Jonathan that we don't have a mass strike wave. I think we do. We have many more strikes than we have had before. And yes, it's true that the RMT and the CWU are both in talks. The CWU have just announced 2 further strike days. Daniel, I think, is right that these isolated strike days are not a sufficient strategy. He knows that better than I do, by the way, for very obvious reasons, but it's pretty clear from the outside that that is the case. But what is also clearly the case is that the Enough is Enough leadership instituted by the CWU are thinking of winding things down, just as far as Enough is concerned, as they wind down their industrial struggle, although they have announced further strike days. But, the fact is that the UCU have got strikes at the end of November. The EIS, which is the teachers in Scotland, voted 96% in favour of strike action on a 71% turnout, and that was announced today. We've got the airline ground handlers, The Dockers, I don't know. I think Liverpool might be about to. I don't know what the situation. They've settled.
That message came through.
That's just come through, but I don't know about Felixstowe. The BMA, obviously, Unison are balloting, as well as the RCN having voted for strike action. Unison are balloting. That's 350,000 members in the NHS balloting, plus the GMB and Unite members and the ambulances. It's
PCS ballot today.
PCS today, a tremendous result. So, I mean, I think it's not over yet. And in the correspondence that I've had with the General Secretary of the Communist Party over this question of what to do with enough is enough, their view seems to be that the government might be about to try to promote a settlement with the RMT and the CWU to get them off the battlefield, but that might be not just in order to focus on austerity and cuts, but also because they realise they're facing a public sector pay battle, and they want key battalions of the private sector off the battlefield, the ones that they don't have to pay for, except insofar as the reduction in profit reduces the tax take from the private sector. So I don't think that is over, and therefore I think there are real forces coming into battle. We need to promote their unity. What we've been arguing for, with some success, practically, not in a paper, but on the telephone and by email and in WhatsApps, is to get, the group in Leicester, the group in Cardiff, the group in Brighton, the group in Nottingham, the group in Newham, to kind of come together in some sort of way so that we can promote these joint formations of action? Is that sufficiently neutral in historical references for you to accept it, off the ground locally, and also to promote a movement towards a new party? Sorry, I did go on.
Again. Okay.
No, I'll waive my right now.
Excellent.
Next question.
Okay.
Thanks everyone. Ephraim from Platypus. I'd actually just like to kind of get Kevin to respond to that point about whether there is a mass strike wave or not. And one of the kind of things that's commonly said, and I think is illustrated by the list that Rich has just run off, is the public sector strength in British unions and the weakness of the private sector. And to try and think about the political moment as well as the economic moment, right? Not to separate economics and politics. I know Richard wouldn't want to do that, but for the form of the talk, did that in his opening remarks. We've had a Conservative government in power for 12 years. The attempt to have a kind of soft left Labour leadership has clearly failed. And the position of the Labour Party is to have a general election now. That's what the march was that the People's Assembly organised. The People's Assembly for Keir Starmer's Prime Ministership, you might deduce from that. And so I'm trying to kind of ask, what is the meaning of this strike wave, such as it is, where you have lots of public sector workers essentially pushing for a situation where to vote out the Tories. And I raise that because the default position of the left every time an election comes around is Tories out. Whether you're for an independent working class party or whether you're for transforming the Labour Party, it seems to always boil down to that one thing. That seems to be the unavoidable trap that the left kind of will fall back into. And obviously there are hundreds of thousands of people being balloted at the moment, but there are tens of millions of people in the country, and lots of those people are working class and have nothing to do with either organised labour unions or the Labour Party. So obviously there is an inflation crisis and an energy crisis, and no one has mentioned the war in Ukraine as a potential cause of that, and where that's what the political.
Well, I did allude to the geopolitics at the beginning.
You did allude to it, but so I would just like to kind of get your thoughts on, obviously when an inflation crisis like that happens, people can experience it in all sorts of different ways. As Kevin, you alluded to, they could become politicized to the right. There are all kinds of depoliticization that happens, actually. Primarily, I think people often can lower their horizons in a situation like that. And it seems like some of the political, some of the upsurge in public sector and transport strikes is motivated actually by an attachment to the Labour Party in the sense of getting the Tories out. So how do you respond to that comment that from the gentleman here, from the Communist League, that there isn't really a mass strike wave, and how do you understand that kind of broader political context of those strikes?
Well, I'll respond to that initially. I'm sure the other two can come in their own way. It's clearly not the same sort of strike wave that we would have seen in the 60s or the 70s. The composition of the labour movement has changed. We know about the restructuring in the economy. So I don't think we need to sort of labour that point too much. I think though one of the things that is perhaps different now is that the conditions under which you strike, for example, the various restrictions on turnouts, also particularly changes in social security law, and benefits and so on will have an impact. Again, we're on a very different plateau, I think, from that earlier period. The reasons why certain groups of workers are more organised than others, again, I think we all know the sociology of that. We all know why that might be the case. The transport workers work collectively. It's a good way to organise and so on. But my own union, the UCU, has a real problem because in many institutions, particularly in the universities, the colleges possibly different, workers are really quite atomised, and to actually get the vote out and to find a group of workers, anyone who's been at the university knows that there are a series of individual offices where you have to sort of, it's a bit like trying to canvass, a whole district of a town and trying to get everybody on side. So the vote in the UCU, I think, is particularly significant because it draws in large numbers of people who are on much more precarious conditions in that way. So I would still define it as a strike wave because I think the phrase is relative, but it's clearly not of the same intensity and of the same character as ones from the earlier period. So, as for the political context, I think, for example, in my own union, the left is, strong. There's a strong, formally organised left in terms of the leadership, but I'm not sure that people are going to go on, strike before Christmas in order to have something to do with the Labour Party's agenda. In fact, if anything, I think that much of the militancy behind the strikes, and particularly the type of solidarity networks, that we're involved in, are, if anything, a rejection of Labour. And there's not a great deal of enthusiasm, I think. I referred to John Rees and Audrey White debating that question, and Richard made some allusion to it as well. I don't see at the rank and file level, or indeed at an activist level, it being anything more than initially an industrial struggle, not particularly targeted in that way. As for the issue, I think a lot will depend really on the nature of not only the political developments from these strikes. I'm certainly not in favour of you must vote Labour all the time, or indeed that any Labour government is better than a Tory government. I wouldn't take that line. I also don't favour the general election slogan because of the way it focuses on, I think, the choice within, two bourgeois parties, and, for the reasons that we've outlined about both a Marxist party, but also our conceptions of socialism don't rest upon the elections of prime ministers. We've got a very different conception of the self-emancipation of the working class. So it's not a particular slogan that I would advance. I've written a little bit about that. If you want to look at the Weekly Worker this week, it's actually in there in opposition to that slogan, for some of the reasons that you said. But I think with some of the leaderships of the unions, and even those who are some distance from them, like Mick Lynch, I think that they want a Labour government because they may be able to obtain some concessions for the Labour bureaucracy, for the trade union bureaucracy. So for many of them, the sort of leverage aspect is, I think, important, and that's for that strata. But as for the rank and file, I think not. I think, it's an economic focus. And for those groups of civil servants that we've been talking about, on quite low pay, it's an absolute necessity. So, I see that it's much closer in some ways to pure economic strikes than anything I've seen since the late 70s.
Yeah, is that all right? Well, just a couple of things in response to that. I wanted to make some remarks on and we're about to be kicked out of the room.
25 minutes.
Yes, talking to you, Ken.
All right. Well, I wanted to say a couple of things about the significance of this. A couple more things about the significance of the strike wave, and then maybe a couple of words on the sort of general election Labour government question. So I said in my initial presentation, just by sheer number of strike days, 2022 is going to see the highest level since 1989. I don't think you can say that's not significant. And although it's true that in many of the high-profile national disputes, unions have pursued a strategy of sporadic 24-hour strikes, which I think are, I can't think of a dispute ever that's been won that way. Something else we've seen in this moment is that the indefinite strike that you've spoken about has actually kind of reappeared on the scene. And a number of groups of workers, barristers firstly, oddly enough, but there you go, and some other groups of workers elsewhere, including some sections of Unite bus drivers, either launched or had plans to launch and didn't because they won before the strike began, indefinite strikes. So that tactic has kind of reappeared, which I think is another marker of the significance. Another marker of the significance is that as well as the big high-profile national disputes, there's been a proliferation of local struggles. So, for example, another indefinite strike that's going on at the minute is in a corn factory in the northeast, quite a small workplace, but it's typical of a number of disputes like that in private sector manufacturing workplaces, often with workers taking quite sustained militant action. Similar strike going on in Jacobs, Jacobs factory in your neck of the woods. That's another marker of the significance. And yet another marker of the significance is that if you compare the current moment to the last sort of strike upsurge in 2011, that very much was concentrated in the kind of white collar, I don't like that term really, but indulge it, the sort of what are thought of as the kind of remaining bastions of public sector trade unionism. Whereas now, I know people think of the railway and the post as sort of, rightly they're thought of as public services, but actually they're private sector. They're private and they're privatised. Not us on London Underground, we're still publicly owned, but National Rail and the Royal Mail are private sector employers. So it's actually, it is private sector workers employed by private sector employers that have been at the vanguard, if you like, of this strike wave, and the kind of health sector, the education sector is kind of following in behind. So I do think that the moment is very, very significant, and I think it's worthy of kind of primary orientation. Last thing, just on the question of Labour government, I mean, I would share, I think, some of the critiques of the weirdly kind of sort of sub-political way that the general election slogan is used. And I think it's unfortunate that the People's Assembly demo, which I think was initially launched around a whole series of kind of policy, was going to be foregrounding a whole series of kind of policy demands, they were all eventually kind of subsumed into the general election demand in, I think, a not very productive way. So I would maybe share some of those criticisms. Having said that, I am for a Labour government, quite explicitly, and maybe that's a difference of emphasis from others on the panel and perhaps others in the room. I am for a Labour government. That is the only governmental alternative to the government by the Tories. And given that reality, I think if the left and the trade unions and the kind of broader Labour movement doesn't directly contest the political content of that government, we are repeating the mistake of the 70s, which is to abandon the political terrain to a right-wing Labour leadership. So given the fact that Labour government is the governmental alternative to government by the Tories, I think it is incumbent upon the left to, well, firstly acknowledge that, and within that to contest the content of that government's programme.
Okay, everyone. So we need to be wrapped up by in 5 minutes. So I think afterwards we're going to the pub. I'm going to actually do a 1 minute, responses or maybe wrap-ups.
I'm done. So.
Is there maybe a final question then people can...
Okay, final question and use it as a wrap-up. That's a great one.
I have a quick
Okay.
question. So my question is, we had some talk with the Vanguard, a lot of talk about the Labour government and Labour Party, about socialism as doing away with the inequality. So I just wanted to ask this, I think perhaps the most abstract question of the evening, which is, what does socialism actually mean for you?
Cool, we can start
What
with
are the ends of your politics?
ends of politics. Kevin,
Well,
you've got 1 minute.
Okay. Okay. Well, it isn't social equality. I think it is human emancipation. And when I made the point about transition, I was talking about the fact that capitalism is unable not only to provide, various material needs for the world's population, but its social impacts, its impacts on us as human beings. So I begin with the idea of freedom, and the way to achieve that, and particularly the idea of the working class as still the universal class that can achieve that. So that's and then the changes in the economy, the collective ownership of property, all of those things I think are subservient to that. Is that a minute? Yeah.
Daniel.
I mean, as you might be able to tell from I'm a member of an organisation that chose to put the word liberty in its title. I think for us and for me, there's also an emphasis on socialism as an emancipatory project, as a project that is about a radical expansion of human freedom. We can talk in sort of formal terms about socialism as a sort of system of economic organisation and democratic control of the means of production and so on. But I think to say only that would miss out that element of how that's tied to a project of expansion of human freedom. So to sort of pithily sum up, I see my political project as pursuing the conquering of social, political, and economic power by the organised working class, and through that a radical expansion of freedom and democracy.
Socialism is a classless society, which means that in taking power, the working class must strive to abolish itself, and as well as dissolving all other social classes. It is an Aufhebung of the emancipatory potential of the working class, not merely an imposition of the suffering and the current status of the proletariat on the rest of society. We have to abolish the status of the working class. It is a class of wage slaves And the working class can only do that themselves. That's why Marx spoke of the working class as having radical chains. He also spoke of the working class as being the universal class, because in abolishing class relations, in establishing direct organisation of production and distribution, in unlocking human potential, the working class has no lower strata of society which it exploits in order to establish some new reactionary exploitative mode of production. Therefore, in this process, it emancipates humanity from its prehistory, raises the human potential to previously unrecognised, unthought of levels, and we can begin to live life as we should.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Big round of applause.